He convinced people to go to war, start smoking cigarettes, swap their light breakfast for a heavier one, and even orchestrated a PR campaign to overthrow an entire government. Was he the greatest marketer of all time, or a world-class manipulator who brainwashed an entire country? Hey y'all, I'm Christina, and this is History and Hearsay, so that means you get to decide. Edward Louis Bernays was born in Vienna, Austria in 1991 to American parents. When Bernays was just 1 year old, his family moved back to America. After completing high school, he continued his studies at Cornell University. To appease his father, he studied agriculture, but it's said that he had no passion for it, and he switched to journalism for his first career. And this career found him in 1912 writing for a review paper, and he wrote a review of a controversial play. He used positive words to describe it, and he was able to sway the opinions and support of some pretty prominent people, including one of the Rockefellers and Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. This opened his eyes to more possibilities, and as he continued with the theater, he began to work as a creative press agent for plays and performers. All of his work as a press agent for theater ended up catching the attention of the Committee on Public Information. And as the U.S. entered the First World War, they hired Bernays to create propaganda to encourage both domestic and international support for the war. The message he was to convey was that the U.S. was joining the war to restore democracy to Europe. Bernays would later describe what he did as psychological warfare. That campaign was extremely successful, and Bernays began to see that his skill set could also be applied in other areas. He said, "I decided that if you could use propaganda for war, you could certainly use it for peace." But when he used the word propaganda in writing about his experience with the CPI, it actually ended up leading to the demise of the organization. So now that he realized that the word propaganda had an extremely negative connotation to it, when he started moving into the private sector, he began to call what he was doing public relations counsel. During his career as a public relations consultant, Bernays is quoted as having said that psychological warfare could be used on the American public with much benefit to the individual and society as a whole. Now, as I mentioned in my previous video, Bernays was actually the nephew of Sigmund Freud. He was a double nephew, in fact. Bernays' mother was Freud's sister, and his father's sister was married to Freud. So Bernays grew up listening to his uncle's theories from Freud himself, but also from his parents. Bernays said that his parents would just be talking about these theories over the dinner table many evenings, and so he was very familiar with his uncle's ideas and the respect that the name Sigmund Freud brought with it in certain circles. And so once Bernays was working in professional settings, it's said that within 10 minutes of meeting him, you would know that he was Sigmund Freud's nephew. He saw the opportunity to attach himself to Freud as a way of having people think of him as more of an expert, like someone who knew more about psychology than just your average Joe, like educated by association, if that's a thing. That was what he was doing anyway. After his success with propaganda in World War I, it's said that Bernays' uncle Freud sent him a copy of his book, A General Introduction to Psychoanalysis. Now, most of us, as I mentioned in the last video, are probably pretty familiar with the basics of Freud's well-known ideas. A lot of psychoanalysis, sexual desires, the subconscious and unconscious mind. It's said that Bernays was completely fascinated with these ideas and that he often referenced his uncle's work, and he began to realize that he could use these Freudian ideas to appeal to the unconscious desires of people and manipulate them into buying almost anything. People wouldn't even realize they were being manipulated. And as I mentioned in my previous video, Bernays was said to be the first to incorporate psychology and other social sciences into PR. There were others who came before him, but none that did things in the way that he did. And there were also people who worked on some of his campaigns with him, but they've been largely forgotten as most PR agents preferred to work behind the scenes and had their clients be the ones who were like up in front, the center of attention. Bernays, however, worked as a PR agent for himself in addition to his clients, and he liked to be out front, making sure everyone knew who he was. He certainly didn't plan to be forgotten. And part of his personal PR was that he was the one who actually gave himself the name the father of modern public relations, and it worked. Professors in media classes are still referring to him as that to this day. This puts us in the 1920s, and prior to this time, products were marketed simply by their practical use. So buy our oil for deep frying. It has a higher smoking point than other oils, or buy this car. It's fast and it's reliable. But after the end of World War I, with the rise of products being made in factories, which of course led to mass productions, companies began to worry that people would soon have all their needs met. Eventually, they wouldn't need anything else, and then they would just no longer buy new things. Now, I know it is hard to imagine this in today's world, but back then it was really only the more upper class people who bought luxury items, and the working class people, they just bought the things that they actually needed. And this realization is what caused corporations to realize that they needed to start changing the way they were advertising products. They needed to figure out, how do you convince people to buy things they don't need? Well, hello, Edward Bernays. Welcome to the conversation. Companies began hiring Bernays to make their products more marketable. Bernays brought with him his brand new strategies, which were focused on using symbols or feelings to encourage people to buy, and he focused a lot on those unconscious desires that we keep mentioning. A very Freudian-inspired campaign of his that I mentioned in my last video was cars. That cars represent male sexuality and masculinity, and I'm sure you guys know that seems to be how sports cars are still marketed to this day. Bernays' main shift from traditional advertising was that you're not selling a product for its purpose, you're selling a feeling, or you're selling like an image of what you want to be or who you want to look like. So during this period in the 1920s and 30s in America, people went from being seen as like their primary function in society being producers because they worked in farms and factories. People were starting to move into the cities more, and corporations started to see people more that their primary purpose was as consumers. It was to spend money and buy their products. Nowadays, we are used to seeing celebrities selling products all the time. It feels like that's like one of the main parts of their job. But Bernays is actually the one who started this, because he started featuring celebrities in ad campaigns and magazines, and then there were product placements in movies, and none of that had been done prior to like him coming along and doing it. So he started to build this connection between beauty and class with his customers' products. And then there were also these new like pushes in the media to be an individual. Don't look and dress like anyone else. You need to buy more clothes in different colors and patterns so that you can express your individual style and be unique and not show up somewhere wearing the same thing as somebody else, right? When I started researching this guy, it was really mind-blowing to realize how much Bernays truly influenced the rise of hyper-consumerism. I feel like every single tactic that we see in advertising today started with him. And when you start actually thinking about how deep some of this really goes into a complete shift in people's mindset, people kind of stop being like community-based, and they really started focusing more on themselves and their own family unit. There was like a complete shift in these communities to find happiness from buying more things. I could actually sit here and talk for hours about how much that actually impacted and changed things in the world, and how we're seeing the effects of that still today, and how much worse it's even gotten since back then. But for the sake of time, we have to move on. And I want to talk to you guys about some of Bernays' most successful campaigns. So in 1918, a watch manufacturer contacted Bernays because they wanted to sell their wristwatches to men, but they could only get women to buy them because of the similarities to bracelets. Wristwatches were seen as feminine, so men just would not wear them. And it's actually said that at that time, if a man was wearing a wristwatch, it was actually to indicate that he was a homosexual. And so that also contributed to men not wanting to wear a wristwatch. And the masculine thing to do at the time was to carry a pocket watch. So Bernays, he did some research, and he discovered that American soldiers were all carrying pocket watches, and that actually lighting a match to be able to see their pocket watch was a good way to attract attention, and it could get them killed if they were on the front lines. So he convinced the U.S. Army that wristwatch could actually save soldiers' lives, and watches became standard issue in the Army. This obliterated the taboo of men wearing watches, and sales skyrocketed. What's more manly than a soldier on the front lines? Another of Bernays' most famous and noteworthy campaigns was basically responsible for normalizing and popularizing American women smoking cigarettes. Now, I did an entire video on this, so I'm not going to go in as much detail. I'm going to touch on it briefly, but I did add a few additional details in here that I left out of the other video to make it a little more interesting in case you guys are watching both. So don't skip. But if you want to see even more details on the subject, go and watch that video here if you haven't seen it. So, in 1928, the cigarette company Lucky Strikes Tobacco hired Bernays to expand their sales. They wanted to solve several problems, and the chief of which was basically to take away the stigma, the taboo that surrounded women smoking in public. And Bernays' idea was that he was gonna link smoking to the suffrage movement that was going on at the time. So he arranged for several young, beautiful women to march down Fifth Avenue during a parade and smoke. Now, Bernays had talked to a psychologist before this who was a fan of Freud's or a student of Freud's. Basically, he was someone who bought into the Freudian ideas. And Bernays asked him, what does the cigarette represent to a woman? And this guy said, the penis. His basic advice was that all women have penis envy, and if we give women cigarettes, it'll be like empowering them. Like they have their own penis now. And so Bernays told these women that he hired to march down the street to call their cigarettes torches of freedom. We got our own penises now, suckers! Sometimes I want to have a talk with women who fall for this kind of stuff. Like, you know, you don't actually need your own penis. Like, at least not one that's attached to you. Too many women underestimate the power they wield by actually just being the woman they were created to be. I will say, there's a part of me that wonders if that's why there's such a push to encourage women to try to be like men all the time and push women away from femininity. I kind of feel like the ones pushing, they actually know that women hold more power if they could actually just be women. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments down below. Now, don't get it twisted. I'm not talking about manipulation. I definitely don't agree with any of that. But I think if you love, honor, and respect your partner, then if you choose well, that person is going to want to give you the same love, honor, and respect. And you can be true partners and accomplish something in life together. Anyways, this march happens, and it's actually led by Bernays' secretary and a few other women that he hired to be there. The newspapers show up because he had tipped them off that this was going to be happening, and they don't know its entire thing has been orchestrated by Bernays not to liberate women, but to sell cigarettes. Funny side note that I saved to tell you guys in this video. Bernays actually hated cigarettes, and he tried to get his own wife to stop smoking. His daughter, Anne Bernays, wrote a book, and she talked about how whenever her dad would discover a pack of his wife's cigarettes, he would pull them all out, snap them. She said, just snap them like bones, just snap them in half and throw them in the toilet. He hated her smoking. That part's a direct quote from his daughter. Of course, Bernays went on to sell cigarettes to women in many other ways as well. They were heavily marketed as a way to quench cravings for sweets and stay slim. Some people have even tied these cigarette campaigns to the ultra-thin movement of the 1920s, but of course, the average person in the 1920s was a lot thinner than the average person nowadays in America, so who knows. In the 1930s, Bernays was hired by Betty Crocker. They had invented this super convenient cake mix that only required water, but it just wasn't selling well, and they couldn't figure out why. Bernays' solution? Just add an egg. He said that when women make cakes with just cake mix and water, they feel guilty in their subconscious because they contributed very little to the actual cake. So, taking Bernays' advice, Betty Crocker changed the recipe so that it would require a couple of eggs. And this, of course, made the product a lot less convenient to use, but their sales skyrocketed. Now, this wasn't just a housewives like to put in more effort kind of thing. It actually goes back to a very Freudian concept. Of course it does. It's a little weird. I guess that goes without saying because I'm talking about Freudian concept here. But the basics of it's like women making a cake with eggs is like they're offering their husband their eggs. And so when they do this, their guilt disappears. She was really doing something for her family. Like she was giving birth to this cake because her eggs are in it. Anyway, we're moving on from that one. In the 1940s, Beechnut Packing Company, the country's biggest bacon producer, hires Bernays to help them because their bacon sales had plummeted. In the 19th century, when manual labor was the norm, people were farmers and miners, they were building railroads, Americans actually ate an enormous breakfast full of eggs, meat, pastries, and so forth. But by the 1940s, work was actually less physically demanding, and this meant that people really didn't need as much to fuel them to get through their days. And of course, they wanted to stay slim. And so as a result of both those things, Americans had whittled down their breakfast. And the average breakfast for an American at that time was just a piece of toast and maybe some orange juice or a cup of coffee. Bernays had a solution. He had a medical doctor on his agency's payroll. Of course he did. And so he asked this doctor, who was actually a well-known New York physician, he asked this doctor, is it possible that a hearty breakfast might be healthier? So the doctor said yes, more energy at the start of the day is a good thing. And so Bernays like, okay, could you write a few thousand of your friends and get them to agree with that? So Bernays' doctor writes 5,000 of his closest doctor friends, and 4,500 of them write back and say, yeah, they could agree with that. So this gives Bernays a story to pitch. Bernays publishes this survey and sends it out to every newspaper, magazine, and radio station around the country. Do you think it was literally everyone? I don't know. That's what it says, but that seems like a lot. So he said it to a bunch of people. I'm sure. So the newspaper headlines read, 4,500 physicians urge Americans to eat heavy breakfast to improve their health. Many of these articles also referenced bacon and eggs as the perfect example of a hearty breakfast. 6 months later, Beechnut sales had boomed and the classic breakfast was back. It's said that not many PR shops have doctors on their staff these days, but Bernays' survey definitely holds lasting marketing lessons. Rather than trying to sell or advertise his product directly, he used experts that his customers trusted to tell the story. We see this all the time now where these independent studies come out telling us something. They're all usually contradicting each other, but if you do a little digging, it becomes obvious why, because these studies are typically funded by the industry that's trying to sell you something. Usually whatever the study cites as the solution to your problem that you may not even have known that you had. This campaign, of course, was massively successful, and today, 70% of bacon sold is eaten at breakfast. Bacon and eggs is an iconic American combo, all thanks to Edward Bernays. As I briefly touched on earlier, all of these campaigns were basically about turning the average citizen into more of a consumer and encouraging people to buy by playing up on their emotional needs, their insecurities, all of that. These new campaigns really did work to sell a lot of things, but here's where it gets a bit more nefarious. It's when you start to see the second purpose that all of the hype of the consumerism did, and that is to allow corporations and politicians to placate people with things and get their minds off of what was happening in politics, the government, the world around them. So basically the goal is to distract people, and it worked. There is so much more that I couldn't include in this video, but there is one thing that I almost forgot that I wanted to share with you guys, and that is the Nazis' connection to Edward Bernays. Hitler and the Nazi Party tried to hire Bernays to actually spread propaganda for them, and he turned them down. He did have some moral compass, I'm assuming, to turn down the Nazis, which obviously that was a good thing. We get to give him credit for that. The person who ended up going on to be Hitler's chief propagandist, Joseph Goebbels, he actually had Edward Bernays' book Propaganda, and a lot of what he did to manipulate people, a lot of it was based on the principles that he learned from his book directly. In the 1930s, Bernays found out that the Nazis were using his strategies, and it said he was shocked, but he also realized that he had put it out there in writing, so of course anybody could pick his book up and then try to implement his strategies. I did see some older interviews with him where people kind of claimed that he was more bragging that the Nazis used his strategies, like he was almost proud of it. So I don't know, but I did find it interesting to note
his connection to the Nazis.
Bernays' campaigns turned truly political once again in the 1950s when he helped lead a campaign for the Chiquita Banana Company. Chiquita at the time was going by their original name, which was United Fruits, and they were an extremely powerful business in South America. So powerful that it had influence over the local government. And when the government tried to regain control in the 1950s, United Fruits launched a PR campaign in retaliation portraying the Guatemalan government as communist. Meanwhile, United Fruits was branded as a crusader against communism in South and Central America. This campaign was so successful that it actually led to a CIA coup to overthrow Guatemala's leaders.
Just a little interjection here. There was a lot more research I would have to do to be able to actually discover what I feel the truth is. Sometimes these topics can become a can of worms, and I want to dig into each little piece of the story, and I just really can't for sake of time. So I'm going to let you guys, of course, make the determination for yourself, which we like to do in the show, of whether this is true history or hearsay. But the current story you'll find if you research this topic now is that the Guatemalan government actually was not communist at all. The propaganda spread by Edward Bernays on behalf of the United Fruits Company made the general American public believe that this communist government was taking control. They were hurting the local farmers. They were causing all these problems. And if we were to go in and help out, we were going to be helping the local farmers get back on their feet and get out from under the control of this communist regime. But in reality, farmers in Guatemala were actually doing better when that local government had taken back over, putting United Fruits back in power, where United Fruits was said to really just bribe local officials and governments and stuff to get whatever they wanted. All of that, putting that back in place, actually hurt the local farmers. They were doing better when United Fruits was kind of out of power and the Guatemalan government was taken back over, and the United States going in and like taking control of the situation and intervening actually really hurt the local farmers more than it helped them.
If you want to learn more, I'll have some sources linked down below. But the Chiquita United Fruits story highlights two very important things about public relations. First, it's very clearly a powerful tool that can have great influence on the public perception. In some circumstances, its power can actually go beyond just perception and lead to something like government action. Of course, this is often on a much smaller scale than like CIA coups, more like lobbyists that are influencing legislation. But knowing that PR can have such a powerful influence over the public, PR persons should hold themselves to high ethical standards, but sadly, this is often not the case. And Bernays was actually very open in his belief that as a PR agent, he manufactured consent. He saw people as not really being smart enough to know what they really wanted, and so he just had to steer them in the right direction by showing them what they wanted by way of clever advertising. There's no denying that Bernays was clearly a genius, and his ability to manipulate people is mind-blowing. Bernays died in 1995 at the age of 103 years old. He's still highly praised today by many in media PR circles as the father of public relations. So, what do you guys think of this one? Had you ever heard of this guy? I've seen interviews with his daughter, and she says that she truly feels that her dad believed what he was doing was for the greater good. But personally, I feel like he just really liked the money, and I felt like he enjoyed seeing just how far he could manipulate people. It seems like everything he did turned to gold for him, and that was probably a really addictive feeling. I can imagine he probably wanted to see how much further he could push people each time he came out with a new genius idea. Leave me a comment down below and let me know what you think. And until next time, check out some more of my videos right here.